recording. Okay, here we go. There, she should be getting in right now.
Yes, yeah. It's loading. Thank you. I appreciate
okay, you're welcome.
that. Hi, Sherry, by the way.
It must have happened like right when. Okay. So let me do this. Usually it pops up right here in the corner. Anyway, so where we were was that between Eden and, we get down to Noah. We'll fast forward through, we saw how Noah, after Noah, that there was we see this continual progression east, right? And in the Bible, east is one of those trigger words that you should pay attention to. So the garden is when Adam and Eve are exiled from the garden, they're exiled to the east because that's where the angel is placed, right, to guard it, or the cherub, and so they flee east and they move eastward, and then when you see the exile of Cain, he goes eastward even more. We go through the Noah story, and when Noah and God starts over with Noah again, it says that men moved east and they end up in Babylon. And we talked about like how Babylon ends up being this place that is, if you think of mankind as eating of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, and they take onto themselves the decision to decide what's right and wrong for themselves, they end up in exile and alienation with each other and with God and with nature and everything else. But if you combine a bunch of people together, you end up with the organization. We said that it was Babylon is the organization, man in his organization against or without God, and it ends up always being oppressive. That's just the way that governments end up being if they don't make God the focus, and really man always does this. They end up with one oppressive regime after another oppressive regime, and that becomes the ultimate symbol, sort of, in a way, for oppression and exile. So they move there, and they are but God scatters them from Babylon. The Tower of Babel is Babylon, and then you're left with the question in chapter 5, or I'm sorry, in chapter 10. Or after the Babylon story. Wait a minute, what happens? Because now God has scattered the nations. It's like humanity's and the nations are in exile now. They're just scattered all over the earth. And we saw in Deuteronomy 32 how God says that when he divided the nations, which is at Babylon there, Babel, when he divided the nations, that he divided them up according to the sons of God, but Israel he has kept as his own inheritance. So we're left hanging after the Tower of Babel story, saying, okay, humanity is in exile, but what's going to happen? And the next story that you have is this right here. It's the story of Abraham, and it starts a new chapter where God is going to start building a nation, and he's going to take one of the nations, build it miraculously, and keep that one for himself. But he's got a plan for the rest of the world. So I call this Exile: Faith, Failure, and Redemption. And we're going to see some of the themes that we've been working with. So what happens is that Abraham is called out from his own homeland, and God just tells him, leave, get out of there, and I'm going to show you a new place. And so you can almost look at it sort of that Abraham, he's got to leave his home behind. In fact, Abraham never ever goes back to Ur of the Chaldees. He sends a servant home to get a wife for his son, but he never ends up going back there. So just to show you where Ur of the Chaldees is, if you have it's way down here where this little red arrow is. Might be a little bit hard to see. If you compare that to where Babylon is, and I lost my cursor. Okay, yeah. If you look at where Babylon is, it's right over here. So it later on it becomes the Babylonian kingdom. So actually, what happens is that God is calling him out of that area of Babylon, what we called East. It's where men had gone into exile in, and he's saying, "I want you to come back, and I want you to come back to the place where actually Israel is going to be, but it's also the sense of where we get the sense that Eden was, and really Eden and Eden and Jerusalem later become described as sort of like those are the two things that are called home in Scripture. So he's saying, I'm going to bring you back to like vaguely where the Garden of Eden was, right? But I'm also going to bring you to a new home, and that's going to be Israel. And ultimately, though, we're talking about the new heavens and new earth way after that. And here's something. So let me jump all the way to Hebrews, and here you see how the writer of Hebrews describes this. Okay, he says, "By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith, he went to live in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city that has its foundations, whose designer and builder is God." You see all those themes kind of like come together right there, where we're talking about like that he's a sojourner. He's not in a home. But think of it, when we see this story in Genesis, we don't see this word city right here, okay? He knows that it's going to be a land where he's supposed to be going to, and he never even gets the promise. You know, he dies before Israel is ever established, and Israel isn't even established for hundreds of years later as their own country. They have to go through the exile in Egypt and come back, you know. So that's way off, but he sees it by faith. But he sees not just that land that God shows him. He sees a city, and what that city is, it's the New Jerusalem. Okay, it's New Jerusalem that we see in Revelation 21. So it's it kind of like it's remember that, you know, like when you see things in prophecy, you see one event, but you're seeing through that event into a prophecy that's going to be later on. So it'll be, you know, Abraham sees the land that God's going to bless him with. He sees the stars, and he sees, you know, that there is going to be a son of his, and something's going to be accomplished. But he sees beyond that too. He sees prophetically even into the future, and he gets a vague sense of that New Jerusalem. It's that place, it's that home that we're all waiting for. So a couple things to think about this here. A journey back from exile. So Abraham's calling is not so much a calling away from home. Yeah, he's called away from Ur of the Chaldees, but what's really happening here is that God is calling him to home. So the question is, how are we going to live while we're waiting for God's promise? Because Abraham does this by faith, but he doesn't do it perfectly. And that's kind of the story of all of our lives. Everybody who's living a life of faith has failure. You know, there's very few people in the Bible where their failures are not mentioned, but where maybe Daniel or Joseph, but that's about it, you know. So, and that becomes kind of like, how do you do that while you're still in exile, waiting for God's promise, and you're sort of in limbo, a wanderer on the earth? How are you going to live? So God tells Abraham and gives him a promise, and he says, your offspring is going to be like the stars that you see. But when that, even though Abraham has that promise, he ends up failing in his faith. And what he does is that him and Sarah both decide to take things into their own hands, just like Adam and Eve did. You call your own shots, the knowledge of good and evil, you're going to do it on your, like with your own definition of good and evil, and it's going to end up with alienation again. And what happens is that they end up oppressing Hagar. So if you think about the story of, and I'm kind of going to be like skipping through these, kind of like assuming that you know these stories a little bit. But what happens is that they're waiting and waiting. God's given them a promise that, they're going to have a kid, but they're getting up in age, and they're like, well, this really isn't going to happen. Are we going to have kids at our age? But God told us that we are, and I don't know. And so what Sarah does is that she decides that she's going to take things into their own hands, and she takes a slave girl named Hagar and gives him to Abraham to sleep with. And really, this is just, it's sexual abuse is what it is. It's not, we can treat it as like, well, you could do that in the culture. It doesn't matter what the culture says. It's abuse. And it ends up being, they end up oppressing basically a slave girl. And it causes problems for them. So here's the Genesis account of that. It says, now Sarah, Abram's wife, had borne him no children. She had a female Egyptian servant whose name was Hagar. Later on in Genesis, she gets referred to as a slave, okay? And Sarai said to Abraham, behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my servant. It may be that I shall obtain children by her. And Abraham listened to the voice of Sarah. What does that remind you of? Abraham listens to the voice of Sarah. It's like Adam listening to the voice of Eve instead of listening to the voice of God. So after Abraham had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Sarai, Abraham's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian, and her servant, and gave her to her husband as a wife. And he went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, she looked with contempt on her mistress. Now, and Sarah said to Abraham, may the wrong done to me be on you. I gave my servant to your embrace, and when she saw that she had conceived, she looked on me with contempt. May the Lord judge between you and me. But Abraham said to Sarai, behold, your servant is in your power. Do to her as you please. Then, check this out, Sarai dealt harshly with her, and she fled from her. This term right here, dealt harshly, it gets picked up again in the story of the Israelites in Egypt when Pharaoh deals harshly with the Israelites. So this is a term right here of oppression. So he's oppressed. Now she returns, and God tells Hagar, no, you got to return, and because God does have a plan for Hagar in the long run. But in the meantime, Abraham is visited by 3 men who turn out to be messengers or angels of the Lord. And they basically tell him, look, you have a son, but this is not the son that God promised you. Sarah's going to bear a son herself, and that's going to be the son of promise. That's basically who you're waiting for. And sure enough, he does have a son. We can look here at Hebrews again. And it says, by faith, Sarah herself received power to conceive, even when she was past the age, since she considered him faithful who had promised. Therefore, from one man, and him as good as dead, were born descendants, as many as the stars of heaven, and as many as the innumerable grains of sand by the seashore. So even though she's had failures in her faith, and Abraham's had failures in their faith, God still just looks at their faith. Yeah, even though him as good as dead. Yeah, he's just, yeah. It is funny. Yeah, Abraham's so old. He's like as good as dead. You know, he can't have kids. You're as good as dead. Wow. Yeah. Well, you know, if you couldn't have kids, I mean, having a lineage come after you was everything in those days. You know, and so it wasn't. There was like a social stigma to it. There was a there was a real desire to have, um, offspring and to really have. Yeah, it hasn't been really until modern times that we think differently about those things, right? So Abraham does end up with a child named Isaac, but even after that, and he sees God's blessing coming through, that tension between Hagar and Sarah still remains. And in fact, there's a tension even now between Hagar's son, Ishmael, and the son of promise, who is Isaac, right? And so it's just caused all kinds of problems, just like with, Adam and Eve having relationship problems, like that taking things into your own hands without God's wisdom in it, ends up in exile, and eventually Hagar is completely exiled from her, the family that she works with, and she ends up wandering in the desert, which is a real picture of exile there. And you see Ishmael here dying because they're dying of thirst, but God saves them and gives them a promise that He's going to build a nation out of Ishmael anyway. So here's a couple things to consider. What do we want more? We've got God's promise and blessing, but do we want that more than God Himself? And when you go to the book of Job, Job really picks up on this theme. In fact, Job is written with this story in mind. It's actually it's harder for a lot of scholars will look at it and go, really, what you're looking at is you're looking at the early stories, because what happens is that it's not just Abraham and Sarah that do these things. They got God's promise and they want what God has got for them, but they're trying to get it on their own terms. And it's the same thing that you really see with Jacob. Jacob ends up, he wants that blessing so bad that he's willing to deceive his brother. He's willing to deceive his own dad. It causes him to go into exile. And he works for Laban, and then he cheats Laban, basically. And he ends up wrestling with God. And the whole time, though, it's like he wants that blessing. So when Satan approaches God about Job, he's kind of referring to that kind of behavior and saying, it's not really that Job loves you, it's your blessing. Job is in love with your blessing. That's what that's what the accuser there is trying to tell God. He's like, he hasn't been tested in this. And so let me skip down to this question. So what is testing for? And testing is to show you where you are with this. Until you're tested, you don't know how much you want God and Himself, as opposed to the things that God has promised you. And this is a big deal here in America with our what do you call it? Prosperity doctrine and everything. Are you really hungry after God, or do you just want Him to bless you, or that you think that, well, you promised something, where is it? And I guess it's just my job to try to get that, and you end up causing all kinds of problems. So, the question is, where are you at? We saw that with Adam and Eve. God is like, where are you? And it's not that God doesn't know where they are in the garden. Again, Jerry brought this up. It's just like, well, where are you at? What's in your mind? What are you thinking? And with Jonah, the same thing, God tests Jonah when he's, when he takes the plant away from him and he's being scorched by the heat. It's like, where are you at? Let's see what's going on with you. And, it's the kind of testing that you do, like if you're trying to test, like, say, an oil pipe or something like that. You put it under pressure. You put it under more and more pressure until you find a leak. And then you let the pressure off. You fix that leak. You put it under pressure again until you see if and if you find another leak, then you work on that. But that's what testing does in our lives. So by the time you get to the story of Abraham, and God's calling Abraham to sacrifice his own son, and this was the son of promise that he got in his old age, and now God is asking him of all things to wait until this boy is like, pretty grown up, and it says, okay, you're expecting a nation to come from this boy, but I want you to sacrifice him. And it's not a random test here, because God is testing him here again. But finally he passes this test, but it's the hardest test of all, if you think, by far. And it's almost like an outrageous kind of a test, but it just shows you that, that testing has made Abraham trust God. He's come a long, long way. If you think about, and this is really what Abraham does, is that when he passes that test, and ultimately God says no, has this angel stop Abraham and says, no, you're not going to do that, and I'm going to provide a sacrifice. The mountain that Abraham went to is in Jerusalem, and it's probably like right here where the Dome of the Rock is. It's where the old temple used to, later on a temple. But so this is the area right here where you can see that dome where he goes to sacrifice himself. Now see this area, let me get this cursor back. See this area down here in this square? It's where they think that Golgotha was up out over here somewhere. It's a little bit of, but the place of the skull and everything. So it's all that area. Now think about this. Abraham had to travel 3 days journey to this place, and God is telling him, we see now that where he brings him to is where the future Jerusalem was going to be. And what Abraham, because this is Mount Moriah. This whole mountain over here is Mount Moriah. If you look at the highest place on Mount Moriah, that's where the temple is built, and that's probably where the highest place on the mountain, because if you built an altar, you would place it the highest part of a mountain. So it stands to reason that that's where Abraham was going to slay Isaac. So he brings him to the place where God would ultimately sacrifice his own son. And it's through Abraham's act of faith, ultimately, that he gets to play a part in that prophetic action that he did, because what he does with Isaac becomes prophetic of what God does with his own son, and he brings him to the very same place. It's really amazing. So here it says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received promises was in the act of offering up of his only son, of whom it is said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able to raise him up from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. So he knew that God was able to raise Isaac up from the dead, and later on we see that God raises Christ up from the dead. There's 3.5 days, there's a 3-day journey that he takes with Isaac, right? And in his mind, to him, Isaac is dead for 3 days. They go up the hill, but who carries the wood? In Abraham's case, it's Isaac. who has to carry the wood up the hill. And in God the Father's case, it's Christ who has to carry the wood up the hill. And there's all these parallels to that story. It's kind of so here's kind of like a summary for us, right? In the same passage here in Hebrews, these all died in faith, and it's talking about a bunch of people who lived in faith but never saw what was coming, just like Abraham never eventually saw that the nation fulfilled, and he never saw, he saw the land, but it was never his home, right? These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. For people who speak this way, make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. If they had been thinking about what land of that land from which they had gone out, hold on. If they had been thinking of that land from which they had gone out, they would have had opportunity to return. But as it is, they desire a better country, that is, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared for them a city. And again, there it's talking about the New Jerusalem. Let me end with this story. And it's a man named John Newton, and he lived in England, was born in 1725. And he grew up with his dad was ran a ship. It was actually, like his dad, I believe, was in the slave trade. And he grew up as a little boy. I think he'd gone and sailed the Mediterranean and everything 6 or 7 times by the time he was like 11 or something like that. He'd gone out a bunch of times. And he got, when he was a bit older, he got a little bit into that, but he was a rabble rouser. He was not a great guy. But he was forced to join the English Navy, but he had just gotten married, and he was now like kept away from his wife for, like months on end. And he decided that he was going to desert. So he ran away, but he was caught and brought back to the ship, and he was whipped until he was unconscious, apparently something like 89 times or something like that. And in front of all the other people on the ship, in front of like his 300 crewmates, he's just like whipped unconscious. And that captain just couldn't stand him, and he actually traded him to another slave ship, and he ended up being brought to Sierra Leone, what's now Sierra Leone, and he's pretty much just abandoned there. So he's stuck in Africa, and he ends up going to prison over there, and then he starts working for this family, but he was so abused, he ends up becoming an indentured servant, a slave himself. He was so abused that he was digging up roots from the ground to eat. He was, and it just reminds me of the prodigal son story, where he's off in a distant land. Now, he had declared that he was raised as a Christian, but he had declared, I'm no longer a Christian. He was bragging about being an atheist, and he was writing all these vulgar songs and everything for the sea captain, or the people he was sailing with. And then he was given to another captain, and he ended up going back out to sea. But he was treated as a slave on that ship too. So whenever they would get to port, he would be chained to the ship, and he couldn't get out. But finally, he got a chance to go back to England. So on the way back to England, though, they hit a storm, and he saw one guy get swept off the deck and like just got lost at sea. But he cried out to God, and he was in the hull of the ship trying to pump water out, but it was a losing battle. There was a hole in the ship, and he thought for sure he was going to die and not make it back to England. But something happened, and a bunch of cargo tipped over and plugged the hole up, like enough so that they could manage the leak, and miraculously he made it back to England, and he was praying, and that was the first time that he came back to Christ, right? But it didn't stick with him. I mean, he got back to England, and he wasn't really stable as a Christian, and he kind of backslid again, and he got back into the slave trade, but he thought for some reason that, well, now that I'm a Christian, maybe I can be an influence on these slave trips to make things more humane or something like that. But it ended up really weighing on his conscience. This is something that kind of haunted him for the rest of his life, and he got really sick. Now, some stories he gets a stroke. Another stories he gets really sick. I don't really know which it is, but he ends up not going out to sea anymore. But he sees that stroke as kind of like he saw it as a judgment from God. I'm not going to comment on the theology of that or anything like that, but he did see it as God's judgment. And he doesn't go back. He quits that line of work, and he ends up becoming a pastor. So he makes a turnaround, and he really started dedicating himself to God. And instead of writing dirty songs and whatever, he starts writing poetry and other like uplifting things. He starts these Bible studies and all that. And later on, in his life, he meets this guy named William Wilberforce. And William Wilberforce is somebody who became a Christian and then came to John Newton for counseling, and wanted to get and he ends up becoming friends with him. And William Wilberforce becomes one of the real pioneers of the abolitionist movement. And so he teams up with William Wilberforce and then becomes a force for the abolition of slavery. And basically, because of William Wilberforce's work, slavery was ended in the West Indies by 1833. But he wrote tracts and other things to kind of like that people could read, and really started pointing them that like really fighting for the end of slavery. So he really kind of like ended up redeeming his life a lot more towards the end. Now, one of the songs, well, actually, so here's something. In 1787, Newton wrote thoughts upon the African slave trade to help William Wilberforce's campaign to end the practice. A business, this is a quote from him, a business at which my heart now shudders, he wrote. Recollection of that chapter in his life never left him, and in his old age, when it was suggested that the increasingly feeble Newton retire, he replied, I cannot stop. What? Shall the old African blasphemer stop while he can speak? And really what this is a story about is somebody who experienced exile, but was also, like Abraham, an agent of exile, causing exile of other people, because he, again, you take that making up your own good and evil and calling your own shots or whatever, you cause pain in people's lives. But in both of these, you have two stories of faith that may start off somewhere and has a lot of failure, but God in his grace is always able to, he's always able to make something and redeem your life, you know. And that's just the nature of God's grace, because God never gives up on Abraham, and he never gives up on Newton. Now, I told you that he wrote songs, and probably the most famous one that we know is Amazing Grace. And so if you know the story now, you know, I don't think that you can hear this song or read the lyrics the same way again. It makes the lyrics so much more poignant, you know. It's amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I am found. I was blind, but now I see. Again, here that exile, right? 'Twas grace that taught my heart to fear. Think about him on the ship when, you know, he thought his life was over. And grace my fears relieved. How precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. So through many dangers, toils, and snares I have already come. 'Tis grace has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. Home. The Lord has promised good to me. His word my hope secures. He will my shield and portion be as long as life endures. Yea, when this flesh and heart shall fail and mortal life shall cease, I shall possess within the veil a life of joy and peace. When we've been there 10,000 years, you know, the New Jerusalem, bright shining as the sun, we've no less days to sing God's praise than when we first begun. So I thought I'd end it there. It's quite a story, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
So if you guys want to have any comments or questions or anything, this is always my favorite part lately, you know. Like amazing what people's experiences, you know. But, you know, like I think we can all sort of like relate to, you know, because we wonder, well, you know, we all believe, you know, like everybody here in this group, you know, we believe in God, and we've all have our stories of faith, and we all have our failings in faith, you know. Let me see here. Somebody typed the chat. So it's just Tane was saying thank you and everything. You're welcome, Tane. So and you know, let me see. In case this study can be watched again as a copy, let me know. I would be interested to watch part I have to skip. No. Okay. I'll do that. I'm going to put this on the, I've been recording this. I am recording right now, and I'll be putting this on the Facebook group. And you can watch the old ones too, because I haven't remembered each time to do the recording, but like last week's is there. And there's a number of other ones that you can watch and kind of like catch up on where we've been. But, you know, I think we all have this experience that we you know, like that we're looking for a home, and we're looking for God's promise, and it's a long ways off. And for us, it's we're waiting for Christ to return. You know, we're waiting for that King, and we're waiting for the new heavens and new earth. And in this meantime, we're living in Babylon. And sometimes, because of the way that we fail, we become Babylon. And, you know, we hurt people and we do all these things. But God's grace is always there to say, hey, you know, I will eventually bring you home, but you need to continue and if you fail in your faith, his grace is always there to pick up the pieces and bring redemption to your life and make it something beautiful and worthwhile And that's our story. You know, our story is one of exile, and our stories are ones where we've caused exile in our lives. You know.
I got a little personal story there. When I came from Germany over here, it was me, myself, and I. I wanted to have the nice weather. I wanted to have those things.
Mm-hmm.
And I made very dumb choices. And just like with all those people, God wiped those bad choices away and turned them into what he wanted it to be. And I would probably have never come to faith if I wouldn't have been in America.
Mm-hmm.
Germany was comfortable. You don't speak about those things. It's all good. But
Yeah.
he had to take all that away for me to be able to give up and say, okay, Lord, I made a mess out of my life. Now you can have it.
Yeah. Most people, when in their testimonies, they, you know, like, is that we have to come to a breaking point. You know, we have to come to a point in failure before we actually change. We
Yeah,
know
and
that
I made all of the mistakes, and I did everything without God. I didn't need no God. I had it together.
Yeah.
And God in his grace said, okay, I'm going to use your stupidity. I'm going to use your dumb decisions, and I'm going to bring you to the place where you're willing to take on my help.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, same thing with Nebuchadnezzar, right?
Yep.
It's like he thinks he's all this and that, and God reduces him to basically an animal, and he loses his kingdom, loses everything. And then once he gets it and he acknowledges God, God gives him a human heart finally. You know, as we see in that vision, that not just that his mind was restored, but we say later in that vision that it was an actual human heart that was given to him. We think, wow, we end up becoming more spiritual or something like that, or closer to God. But no, what it is that closeness to God is the ultimate humanity. You know, your ultimate humanity is really where your will is submitted to His, because He loves you so much. You know.
Yeah, and only when you realize this and accept that do you actually have a life. Everything else is just an existence.
It is just an existence. It's exile.
Yeah.
You know, and I forget where. Remember, Rachel, you were listening to a podcast the other day. I think it was yesterday, where somebody was talking where like about verses where God is our home. You know, yeah. Do you remember where those verses were?
No,
but
I can look it up.
I mean, you Google that, I guess. You know.
Well, it might be on the show.
Yeah, but you know, it's like ultimately God is your home, and He's our refuge, you know, and it's kind of like, but like a lot of times you end up being brought to the end, and like the greatest, most transformational stories that I've ever heard from other Christians is like just like your experience, Chris, where you know, like you end up at your end, and when you come to the end of yourself, then finally you end up coming home. Yeah, the prodigal son, right?
Yep.
You know, he ends up like starving in a foreign land, and it's a self-imposed exile. It's like, give me my inheritance. He wants that blessing before he wants blessing on his own term. It's like, Father, you promised me this, and I'm going to take it my way, just like we talked about tonight. And then he goes out and he squanders it all. He loses it all, and he ends up starving. And he goes, you know what? Even he ends up wanting to eat what the pigs eat. So he's reduced to the animals again. You know, it's like
I was homeless with 2 kids in a country with no money.
Yeah, so, you know,
Didn't
far
even
away
speak
land,
the language.
exile, being reduced to like being a beast or something. And he goes, you know, even the lowest servants in my father's house eat well. I'm going to go back, you know. And then when he does, his father's not mad at him. His father is just happy to see him come back.
It was go back, find my way back to that cross.
Yeah, yeah. It's a beautiful exile and redemption story. So, exile, faith, failure, and redemption.
Yep.
All right, my battery's about to die. I'm going to sign off, you guys, and I'll see you guys next week, okay?
Have
All
a
right.
great week. Thank you,
All right.
Mark.
You
You're welcome.
too. Bye.
Bye.